Hey, what's going on, guys? Arma Reforger just got a fresh update, and there is actually a pretty good mix here of gameplay changes, vehicle tuning, bug fixes, and some modding side updates too. This is one of those patches where a few notes sound simple at first, but once you think about what they mean in an actual match, they can change the flow of a fight a lot more than you would expect. Bohemia also pushed it live across Steam, PlayStation, and Xbox, so this is not one of those PC first, console later situations. The biggest thing by far is the new contested base state. That is really the centerpiece of the whole update. Before this, base capturing was set up around a pretty basic two-faction setup, and the devs said they needed something that gave players better feedback. So now if defenders are outnumbered and a capture is not actually starting, the base can become contested instead. That means the game is basically telling everybody, hey, something is going on here, but it is not quite a full capture yet. And I think that matters because in these kinds of matches, information is everything. If a base is being messed with, you want the game to make that obvious instead of leaving people guessing why their spawn is suddenly awkward or why pressure is building somewhere off screen. What makes that system interesting is that it is not just a label. A contested base prevents defenders from spawning there, and it shows up on the map with a soft red glow around the base. So you're getting a real gameplay consequence, not just a visual warning. At the same time, it also gives defenders more information, which is kind of the whole point. Instead of just stumbling into a bad situation, the map is now telling you that a zone is hot and probably needs attention. The dev notes also explain that this is meant to help with situations like enemy presence in the backline while still stopping people from spawning into active frontline chaos. There is also a new move, Closer pop-up, for an enemy that is capturing or contesting a base. That is the kind of thing that sounds tiny when you read it, but in practice, it can save a lot of confusion. Sometimes players see a base is under pressure and do not immediately know how close they actually need to get to make a difference. This kind of prompt is basically the game nudging you, saying, you are not in the right place yet. Keep moving. That fits really well with the new contested system because the whole update seems aimed at making base pressure easier to read at a glance during live play. There is a pretty important change to supplies too. Players can no longer drop supplies on the ground from containers controlled by the enemy faction, with the exception of harbors and pre-placed caches. That one is clearly there to close off some weird edge cases and stop players from using enemy-controlled storage in ways that probably were not intended. It is the sort of fix that might affect every match, but when it matters, it really matters. Any game built around logistics and territory control has to be careful about what counts as fair access and what becomes a loophole, and this patch clearly tightens that up. Another pretty neat change is the Renegade faction handling. Now, when someone turns Renegade, the game forces them into solo groups to avoid problems with name tags and group text communication. That is one of those under-the-hood fixes that probably makes the whole social side of the mode feel cleaner without most players even knowing why. They also fixed several name tag and faction display issues, including cases where friendly and hostile labels were not updating correctly, or where Renegade player prefab setup caused name tags to show after respawn. So this is really about keeping the identity side of the game from getting messy in the middle of a match. On the arsenal and rank side, there are a few important quality of life fixes too. Rank-locked items were showing generic info or the wrong icon when a player's faction did not have the required rank configured correctly. That sounds minor until you realize how often players rely on those little UI details to understand what they can and cannot equip. There were also fixes for a tooltip issue, faction changes not updating compositions correctly after a capture, and factions not behaving right in some free-for-all style setups. That is the kind of cleanup that usually makes the game feel less buggy without changing the actual content itself. Vehicles got a healthy amount of attention as well, and some of the changes are pretty noticeable. The LAV-25 collider was changed, which ties into the Wavebreaker 5mm armor note, and there were also tweaks to item size limits for vehicle internal storage. On top of that, machine guns and sniper rifles were clipping through the shoulder while semi-lowered, and that got adjusted too. Then there are fixes like blocked muzzle flash with weapon attachments, the wrong color on the BRDM-2 hazard, brake and rear lights, and the wrong safety distance on hydro rockets. So, yeah, it is a broad set of fixes, but that is exactly the kind of patch where you want the devs to touch all the odd little rough edges people keep running into every session. There are also a couple of vehicle behavior changes that will probably be felt more than they sound. The minimum speed for shifting gear direction between drive and reverse got increased, wheel friction was adjusted, and the center of mass plus suspension for the BRDM-2, S105, and S1203 were lowered a bit to help with excessive rollover. If you have played vehicle-heavy matches, you already know how annoying it is when a vehicle feels like it tips or behaves strangely for no real reason. Those kinds of tweaks can make driving feel much less sloppy, and I like that this patch is paying attention to that instead of only fixing the obvious crashes and UI issues. They also fixed the bug where wheels would rotate forward when going backwards on non-owner proxies, which is exactly the sort of thing that would look off in multiplayer and break immersion immediately. A few general fixes are worth calling out too. Players should no longer spawn inside geometry, which is one of those bugs that can completely ruin the start of a session. Animations influencing multiple model instances got fixed, the M998 front wheel animation was corrected, and there was also a fix for the impossible base radio relay dismantle situation when it was built right next to the objective. They also improved the third-person vehicle camera zoom, fixed an odd flying dragon tooth near the transformer station base, and corrected the perceived faction not updating when all clothes were off. That last one is such a specific problem that it almost makes you stop for a second and go, wait, that was a bug? But it is exactly the kind of weird edge case that a live game can accumulate over time. The stability and performance side is where you see the patch trying to make the game feel sturdier across the board. There is support for micro-freeze detection in log stats now, and the game no longer creates prefab data for sound components when running without sound, which should help headless or no sound setups behave better. Several crash fixes were included too, like a crash when loading terrain, a crash on PS5 when using binoculars at 4K resolution, a crash tied to non-damage effects damage over time, possible crashes when streaming a character with no active physics, and a possible crash when MP signals were used. There are also fixes for group ID replication, the group ID resetting behavior, suicide in the dedicated server plugin triggering a VME, and a VME when spawning as a Civ faction in HQC conflict. This is the kind of list that does not sound glamorous, but every line there is probably somebody's ruined session finally getting sorted out. The modding section has a couple of useful changes too. A hierarchy component was added to sign supply storage base.et, and the old setup where hierarchy components were added through the composition was removed. The base capture query was also changed to use the tag system instead of the query system for performance reasons, though that does come with the loss of a method. On top of that, there is a fix for a memory leak in the script syntax tree attribute nodes, and a world editor fix where the WB score after world update callback was not being called correctly to entities and components. So if you are somebody who works with the editor or builds custom content, this patch is not just about gameplay changes. It is also about keeping the tools healthier. What stands out to me most here is that the update feels focused. It is not trying to reinvent the whole game, and it is not packed with giant new systems for the sake of looking impressive. Instead, it tightens the core loop, especially around base fighting, spawn behavior, faction logic, and vehicle handling. That contested base change alone can shift how matches feel because it makes the game better at telling players what kind of fight they are actually in. Add in the spawn fixes, the supply restriction changes, the vehicle polish, and the crash work, and you end up with a patch that looks a lot more meaningful once you start connecting the dots. It is the kind of update that should make matches feel clearer, smoother, and a bit less frustrating when things get messy.